Part 5 of Mr. Pickwick's Christmas. If anything could have added to the interest of this agreeable scene, it would have been the remarkable fact of Mr. Pickwick's appearing without his gaiters, for the first time within the memory of his oldest friends. "You mean to dance?" said Wardle. "Of course I do," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Don't you see I am dressed for the purpose?" Mr. Pickwick called attention to his speckled silk stockings and smartly tied pumps. "You in silk stockings?" exclaimed Mr. Tupman jocosely. "And why not, sir? Why not?" said Mr. Pickwick, turning warmly upon him. Of course there is no reason why you shouldn't wear them," replied Mr. Tupman. "I imagine not, sir. I imagine not," said Mr. Pickwick in a very peremptory tone. Mr. Tupman had contemplated a laugh, but he found it was a serious matter, so he looked grave, and said they were a pretty pattern. "I hope they are," said Mr. Pickwick, fixing his eyes upon his friend. "You see nothing extraordinary in the stockings, as stockings, I trust, sir?" "Certainly not, no, certainly not," replied Mr. Tupman. He walked away, and Mr. Pickwick's countenance resumed its customary benign expression. "We are all ready, I believe," said Mr. Pickwick, who was stationed with the old lady at the top of the dance, and had already made 4 false starts in his excessive anxiety to commence. "Then begin at once," said Wardle. "No!" Up struck the 2 fiddles and the 1 harp, and off went Mr. Pickwick, into Hands Across, when there was a general clapping of hands and a cry of "Stop, stop!" "What's the matter?" said Mr. Pickwick, who was only brought to by the fiddles and harp desisting, and could have been stopped by no other earthly power, even if the house had been on fire. "Where's Arabella Allen?" cried a dozen voices. "And Winkle," added Mr. Tupman. "Here we are!" exclaimed that gentleman, emerging with his pretty companion from the corner. As he did so, it would have been hard to tell which was the redder in the face, he or the young lady with the black eyes. "What an extraordinary thing it is, Winkle," said Mr. Pickwick rather pettishly, "that you couldn't have taken your place before." "Not at all extraordinary," said Mr. Winkle. "Well," said Mr. Pickwick with a very expressive smile, as his eye rested on Arabella, "well, I don't know that it was extraordinary either, after all." However, there was no time to think more about the matter, for the fiddles and harp began in real earnest. Away went Mr. Pickwick, hands across, down to the middle, to the very end of the room, and halfway up the chimney, back again to the door, poussette everywhere, loud stamp on the ground, ready for the next couple, off again, all the figure over once more, another stamp to beat out the time, next couple, and the next again. Never was such going. At last, after they had reached the bottom of the dance, and full 14 couple after the old lady had retired in an exhausted state, and the clergyman's wife had been substituted in her stead, did that gentleman, when there was no demand whatever on his exertions, keep perpetually dancing in his place, to keep time to the music, smiling on his partner all the while, with a blandness of demeanour which baffles all description. Long before Mr. Pickwick was weary of dancing, the newly married couple had retired from the scene. There was a glorious supper downstairs, notwithstanding, and a good long sitting after it. And when Mr. Pickwick awoke, late the next morning, he had a confused recollection of having, severally and confidentially, invited somewhere about 45 people to dine with him at the George and Vulture the very first time they came to London, which Mr. Pickwick rightly considered a pretty certain indication of his having taken something besides exercise on the previous night. "And so your family has games in the kitchen tonight, my dear, has they?" inquired Sam of Emma. "Yes, Mr. Weller," replied Emma. "We always have on Christmas Eve. Master wouldn't neglect to keep it up on my account, or any account." "Your master's a very pretty notion of keeping anything up, my dear," said Mr. Weller. "I never see such a sensible sort of man as he is, or such a regular gentleman." "Oh, that he is," said the fat boy, joining in the conversation. "Don't he breed nice pork?" The fat youth gave a semi-cannibalic leer at Mr. Weller as he thought of the roast legs and the gravy. "Oh, you've woken up at last, have you?" said Sam. The fat boy nodded. "I'll tell you what it is, young boa constructor," said Mr. Weller impressively. "If you don't sleep a little less, and exercise a little more, when you comes to be a man, you'll lay yourself open to the same sort of personal inconvenience as was inflicted on the old gentleman as wore the pigtail." "What did they do to him?" inquired the fat boy, in a faltering voice. "I'm going to tell you," replied Mr. Weller. "He was one of the largest patterns as was ever turned out. Regular fat man as hadn't caught a glimpse of his own shoes for 45 years." "Lor!" exclaimed Emma. "No, that he hadn't, my dear," said Mr. Weller, "and if you'd put an exact model of his own legs on the dining table afore him, he wouldn't have known them. Well, he always walked to his office with a very handsome gold watch chain hanging out, about 1.25 foot, and a gold watch in his fob pocket as was worth, I'm afraid to say how much, but as much as a watch can be. A large, heavy, round manufacture, as stout for a watch as he was for a man, and with a big face in proportion." "You better not carry that here watch," says the old gentleman's friends. "You'll be robbed on it," they says. "Shall I?" says he. "Yes, you will," says they. "Well," says he, "I should like to see the thief that could get this here watch out, for I'm blessed if ever I can. It's such a tight fit," says he. "Whenever he wants to know what o'clock, I'm obliged to stare into the baker's shops," he says. Well, then he laughs as hearty as if he was going to pieces, and out he walks again with his powdered head and his pigtail, and strolls down the Strand with the chain hanging out further than ever, and the great round watch almost busting through his grey, cursy smalls. There weren't a pickpocket in all London as didn't take a pull at that chain, but the chain would never break, and the watch would never come out. So they soon got tired of dragging such a heavy old gentleman along the pavement, and he'd go home and laugh till the pigtail vibrated like the pendulum of a Dutch clock. At last, one day, the old gentleman was a-rolling along, and he sees a pickpocket as he knowed by sight, coming up, arm in arm, with a little boy with a very large head. "Here's a game," says the old gentleman to himself. "There's going to have another try, but it won't do." So he begins a chuckling very hearty, when all of a sudden the little boy leaves hold of the pickpocket's arm and rushes head foremost straight into the old gentleman's stomach, and for a moment doubles him right up with the pain. "Murder!" says the old gentleman. "All right, sir," says the pickpocket, whispering in his ear. And when he comes straight again, the watch and chain was gone. And what's worse than that, the old gentleman's digestion was all wrong ever afterwards, to the very last day of his life. So, just you look about you, young fella, and take care you don't get too fat. As Mr. Weller concluded this moral tale, with which the fat boy appeared much affected, they all three repaired to the large kitchen, in which the family were by this time assembled, according to annual custom on Christmas Eve, observed by old Wardle's forefathers from time immemorial. More tomorrow.